The recovery still hadn't started. It was a challenging time for all businesses. Prices were spiraling upwards, there were strikes and union militancy. At first, Washington and General MacArthur saw these as problems for the Japanese to solve themselves. But as the Cold War intensified in 1948 and China went communist, American policy changed. A strong Japan was needed as a bulwark in the Pacific, so Japan's sick economy, heavily subsidized by the American taxpayer, was now a liability. Reparations were forgotten. Ending the arm's-length relationship, the Americans sent Joseph Dodge, a conservative banker, and gave him special powers to sort things out as economic commissar for Japan. He had to deal with an inflation rate of 1,200% over 4 years. To balance the budget, Dodge cut government spending and the subsidies which had kept industry limping along. Thousands of government workers were fired. Though prices stopped rising, Dodge's cure seemed more severe than the disease. Unemployment rose. Output was dropping even lower, and companies were facing bankruptcy when help came from an unexpected quarter.
依然激戦続く南朝鮮の戦線では国戦共産軍を撃退したアメリカ海兵隊が相当に活躍。
A Japanese politician called the Korean War a gift from the gods. With American troops 5,000 miles from home, it was Japanese firms who had to supply them. The American turnabout was now complete. Japanese industry was once again needed for what it had excelled in, making arms.
岩山を切り開いた神奈川県下のこの大掛かりな地下工場こそはかつての日本軍の兵器廠です。民間に払い下げられた今日、いわゆる特需の波に乗って再び兵器製造に乗り出し、航空機用の照明弾などが作られています。また大阪方面では迫撃砲弾、発煙弾などの大量生産が行われ、異様な活況を呈しています。
At Yawata, they worked 24 hours a day.
八幡に行く前は2年間作業してない。
2 years I'd been in a plant which hadn't produced anything at all. I thought there was nothing quite so bad for a human being as not having a job or anything to do. So it was better to be told, come on, make more.
楽ですね。
朝鮮動乱あたりで思い出しますのはですね、やはり
What I remember about the Korean War was the competition between the furnaces to make steel. Whichever team met the target first won a bonus.
We made steel rails, and the crossbars, supports, and steel plates for bridges, and the parts for putting up barbed wire entanglements, defense goods, and construction material, which there was a demand for throughout Japan. The special procurement created a national boom, but we were particularly close, and we could make anything here.
この特需ブームに煽られてか、証券取引所は東西ともに空前の馬鹿げき。徹夜徹夜で整理がつかず、ついに立ち会い中止というありさま。
Our income from special procurement for the war was $600 million in 1950. In 1951 and 52 respectively, it was $800 million each year. The foreign exchange that income provided allowed us to increase our imports. Therefore, our economy started to balance. So in my opinion as an economist, the Dodge Line certainly reduced inflation, but it was the Korean War which gave Japan its first post-war opportunity to recover, really by the hand of fate.
But in 1952, with the occupation over and independence regained, the Japanese still weren't back to the pre-war standard of living. Of a population of 90 million, half still worked on the land. Japan's GNP was 15th in the world, behind Venezuela. GNP per head was 1/10 of the United States. few in the West saw this poor, overcrowded country as a serious industrial competitor. What they forgot was Japan's phenomenal growth between 1880 and 1940, and the attitudes and institutions that achieved it. Japan had begun to industrialize in the 1880s when catching up with the West became a national obsession. Two features of this drive helped its success: a close relationship between government and industry, and an ability to seek out and rapidly introduce the best technology the world had to offer. They learned cotton textile production from Britain, importing the bricks for the early mills as well as the machines to create their first great export success. They learned steelmaking from Germany and the United States, building a large steelworks from scratch at Yawata. And they used the steel plates to build ships, which they'd also learned from the British. From the start, an elite class of government bureaucrats guided Japanese industry in the direction that would bring the greatest benefit to the country. From the 1930s, the emphasis was on building up military power. During the war, government took total control. Industrialists had to obey orders. The same officials stayed on after the war, and Kishi, the brilliant Minister of Munitions, reappeared as Prime Minister of Japan in 1957. When coal production had to be raised in the recovery drive, it was government who gave the directions, and the ministry that was in charge.
2000弱の構内に初めて入った水谷さん。摂氏43度という猛烈な蒸し暑さの中で、しみじみと労働者の苦しさを味わいました。
So a line of continuity and a wealth of experience ran from the Ministry of Munitions, which changed its name back to the Ministry of Commerce in 1945. And then became the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, in 1949. With no equivalent in other countries, MITI saw itself as an industrial high command, deciding which industries should be given priority.
We
had to give resources and material to certain key industries. Some needed finance, others needed technology, especially from abroad. So at the beginning, these three things, resources, finance, and technology, were concentrated into the priority industries.
Shipbuilding was to go ahead first and fastest. Most of the slipways had survived the bombing. Just as important, there was a pool of engineers. Unlike Britain, Japan had trained shipbuilders at university level. Even when steel shipbuilding was banned by the Americans and the yards made fishing boats, the universities still turned out engineers.
I remember the majority of graduates were given temporary jobs outside shipbuilding where they were like a sort of reserve army. So when needed, they could start work straight away in the yards building large ships. People realized at some stage shipbuilding would again become essential for Japan. The time would come when we'd be allowed to build ships once more.
Once the restrictions were lifted, this reserve army could start work. They'd use the interval to study the latest methods.
一方、溶接貨物船として戦後最大の新造船調和丸が横浜港外において試運転を行いました。この豊洋大型船の見学に学童1004名が社会科の勉強に訪れました。
私が卒業する直前ですけれども、私ども
Just after I graduated, my professor said to me at dinner, "Soon you'll build many large ships. I want you to do your best when this time comes. England is now building over half the world's ships, but Japan has got to take over. You must replace England as the greatest shipbuilder in the world.
Japan's great advance started at the former naval yard at Kure, where they'd built the battleship Yamato. They saw that the cranes and large dry dock used for the Yamato could be used to make tankers on a production line. The engineer and pioneer of modern shipbuilding techniques was Dr. Shinto.
During the war, I was a shipbuilder, but there was a shortage of aircraft, and I was ordered to make them instead. I was put in charge of planning production. I received a set of plans from the Air Force. Studying these, I realized there were other ways of organizing things. And I started to think about how some of the techniques of aircraft production could be applied to shipbuilding.
The method Shinto developed was called block construction.
一つ一つのビームや外板などを船台上に運び上げて両打ちを行っていた昔の方法と変わり、現在は船台の前の広い作業場で自動溶接機を使って大きなブロックにまとめ、それを強力なクレーンで船台に運び取り付けるようになりました。
Soon, Kure was completing ships in 7 months from start to finish instead of 18 months or more. The lessons were applied in yards all over the country. The Japanese traveled abroad to see if there was more they could learn. Mr. Koga from Nagasaki went to Britain in 1954.
None of the shipyards would show me around, so I took the sightseeing into my own hands. I went to the Clyde, where there were shipyards on both banks, and for about 3 days I took photographs and various measurements by eye. Even if they wouldn't let me inside, I was able to get a pretty clear idea of what they were doing. As soon as I saw something, my mind would start to work, and I was pretty much able to judge what was going on. I could see from outward appearances that nothing much had changed. They were still doing things just as they had always done. Very well, but in an old-fashioned way. While Japan was advancing every day.
The Japanese were building in a new way, and they were making the new types of ships the world wanted. Tankers and bulk carriers built to standard designs.
戦後最大のオイルタンカー、その名も日英親善のスタンバックジャパン号は9月6日、三菱長崎造船所で進水式を挙げました。全部溶接、高温高圧のボイラーを備える最高級船です。
Soon, even British buyers were coming to Japan. The ships were cheaper, and they were ready on time. At Nagasaki, now the busiest yard in the world, it seemed like a victory for the old team.
We had built big passenger liners, big warships. So tankers and bulk carriers were extremely primitive from a technical point of view. Speaking from the point of view of somebody who had made warships, it was just like making matchboxes. They weren't really ships at all.
叱られるかもしれんけどね。
日本の造船は戦後最高の好景気に恵まれ、神戸、大阪をはじめ各地の造船所は文字通りの造船ブームに沸き立っています。
Japan took the lead in shipbuilding by making the best possible use of its inheritance of skilled labor and shipyards which survived the war.
ことに年末になっての工事量は全部で280隻415万総トンに上り、その8割は世界各国から注文の輸出船で、これによって日本の造船はイギリスを抜いて世界一となりました。
Rebuilding the steel industry, which was closely linked to shipbuilding, was much more expensive and took longer. But to the civil servants of Meaty, it had a central importance.
食べ物を食わなければ生きていけないと。それと同じように、鉄は産業の
Just as people have to eat to survive, steel is the food of industry. I think everyone realized this at that time. And so when it came to resources such as finance, government help, and so forth, steel was given priority over all other industries. I really think the Japanese people thought this was right.
The Japanese steel industry was way behind. The mills that filled the Korean orders and made the plates for the ships were worn out. It still took Japan 7 times as many man-hours to make a ton of steel as it did the Americans, twice as many as the British. In 1950, Japan produced 5 million tons a year, the United States 90 million. So senior steelmen went to America to study the most productive industry in the world.
アメリカの鉄鋼業を見まして、
After seeing the American steel industry, I realized that in one plant alone, the scale of the operation was enormous. And unless the Japanese steel industry produced 10 million tons a year, it wouldn't be possible to construct American-style steelworks in Japan. My dream, first and foremost, was to see the Japanese steel industry hitting that 10 million ton target.
まず1000万トンの鉄鋼業達成にありました。
To realize the dream, they needed new works on large sites with deep water anchorages. But land was scarce, so they reclaimed it from the sea.
セル工法によってスピーディーに岸壁工事が進む。将来世界の各地から鉄鉱石や原料炭を運ぶ大型専用船を直接横付けできる大岸壁がここに生まれる。それは鉄鋼業の立地条件の最も大きなものである。
We wanted to build bigger works, faster works, works which we could lay out exactly as we wanted, where we could rationalize the transport as much as possible. If we could do that, raw materials would end up cheaper, and production would be much faster, and we could organize things just as we wanted. So all the companies started looking for new locations.
Steel was getting top priority. Funds approved by Meaty came from a special industrial bank which drew on savings kept in the post office by ordinary Japanese. More money came from the World Bank and direct American aid. The increasing capacity was a gamble on Japan's future growth. Each new blast furnace was bigger than the last.
昭和34年9月1日、新しい戸端第一溶鉱炉の火入れ式。炉前に祭壇が設けられ、古式にのっとり火入れの儀が行われます。続いて小島社長をはじめ各代表がそれぞれこの火種を田口から炉内に入れていきます。送風開始の鐘が鳴ります。
Though most of the technical help came from America, the Japanese followed developments everywhere. When an obscure Austrian firm invented a cheaper and faster way of steelmaking by using blown oxygen, the LD process, the Japanese saw its potential more quickly than anyone else. LD steelmaking was introduced fastest in Japan, bringing costs down. Production was racing ahead.
In fact, Japanese steel output in 1945 was zero. In 1950, it was just a few million tons.
In 1960, well, every 5 years, it was increasing several times over. So in 1960, it was 20 million, and nearly 50 in 1965. Production doubled every 5 years.
If steel was the food of industry to start with, they realized that chemicals would be just as important in the future. Meaty encouraged new petrochemical works to make the plastics and chemicals Japanese industry would need in growing quantities. The Japanese knew that as well as securing technology from abroad and directing investment, they had to improve their management. Later, Japanese management would become something the rest of the world aspired to. But back in the days of the occupation, once the American policy had changed, the Americans had been the teachers. During the occupation, Homer Sarazone came as an advisor from Western Electric.
With the feudal background that all Japanese had, they could only understand a straight line, a sequence of authority. The man in power spoke only to the next man in line, spoke only to the next man in line. This, to my way of thinking, was a very inefficient way of running a company.
Sarazone and his colleagues devised a course to teach managers of Japanese electrical companies the basic principles of American management.
And the rules were very simple. The only person who could attend was a chief executive from the company. He had to attend every day for 8 hours a day, 4 days a week. There would be homework, and they had to go home and do the work. And they asked, well, will there be a final exam? And we told them that, yes, their final exam would be the annual report, the business report. If their companies did well, we would know that they understood what we were trying to convey.
言ってみればその神様がやってきたような気がした。
It was as if we'd been visited by the gods. I really thought they were amazing people. And when I thought about it, I realized that Western Electric had sent their best people. I also realized that these were the most useful people to us from the occupying forces.
But the greatest management problem was the poor quality of Japanese goods.
Japanese quality, Japanese manufacture was shoddy. If a legend were stamped on the bottom of a product which said made in Japan, you knew it was shoddy merchandise. Japanese quality reputation was abysmal.
The Japanese knew they had a problem. American experts came to the factories to help them. With missionary zeal, they taught them the techniques of quality control that had been developed in American war factories. A 6'4" statistician, J. Edwards Deming, found they paid more attention to him in Japan than they did at home. Deming got on with the Japanese. He encouraged them with his confidence in what statistical quality control would do for them.
No, there's no difficulty getting people to agree they ought to improve, but how to accomplish that is not so simple. It requires structure. It requires identifying what needs improving and then assigning a clear responsibility, providing the training and the tools. Those things appeal to them, and I would say that may have had the biggest impact of any of the things I brought to them, because in terms of improving quality, they went at it at a revolutionary pace.
The Japanese adopted the quality control message from their American teachers and developed it themselves.
一般に管理というのはこの図が示すような手順、つまり計画、実施、チェック、アクションを繰り返して行うことにより、より高度の管理水準へと発展していくことができるのです。この管理のサークルを私たちが製品を作るときに適用したものが皆さんご存知の
From 1955, there were regular trips to the United States to expose more Japanese to the wonders of American productivity. Hosted by the American government, the groups included both trade unionists and managers like Mr. Karatsu.
When we were on the highway, there were masses of other cars there. My God, perhaps these Americans work all day and all night, I thought. Next, we went to the Bell Telephone Laboratory, the world's biggest research laboratory. Then we got in the bus and went to another amazing factory. This was in New Jersey, the Allentown Vacuum Tube Factory. It was Western Electric, and it was Western Electric who first carried out quality control here in Allentown. This was the birthplace of QC, so we were very moved. And another very surprising thing was the head of QC at Allentown was a woman, and I still remember her name.
Miss Bonnie Small.
And the Pilgrims went to Detroit, the home of American mass production.
And they took so many pictures, and it was amazing that American companies allowed us to take pictures of every corner of their operations. And one American project manager, we usually had a project manager from the United States accompanied us, and one of them commented, I have never seen such a studious and well-organized and hard-working group like from Japan.
In the late 1950s, new export industries were just beginning to make an impact in the West. Japanese cameras were one of the first. The story was the same: a base of established skill, a deliberate search for new technology, then quality production. The Nikon Optical Company had ground lenses for gun sights during the war. After 1945, they decided to make 35mm cameras, then dominated by the Germans.
The lens we took from contacts. And the rangefinder we took from Leica. And the shutter was also Leica. And the body, and the way of taking out films and replacing films was contacts.
Early profits were ploughed back into their own original research and improvements. Soon, high-quality cameras were being made not individually, one by one, but on a production line. Within a few years, Japan was making more cameras than Germany. The speed with which the Japanese got hold of new technology and put it into production showed itself most in the formation of the electronics industry. Dr. Ibuka, whose low-tech rice cooker had been a failure just after the war, had persevered and moved on to make Japan's first tape recorders. Then he heard about a new breakthrough in America.
This is how my voice would sound over a 75-mile telephone line that has no amplifying device. Now, with a transistor amplifier in the line, my voice is amplified so that you can hear me distinctly.
The transistor was an all-American invention. The solid-state semiconductor would replace the bulky vacuum tubes, which were unreliable and hard to make. Developed at Bell Labs, the leading research center, the American scientists had won the Nobel Prize for it. Generously, the Americans let all comers have access to their work, including Dr. Ibuka from Tokyo. Sketches of the device, which would start an electronic revolution, were sent back to Japan. Then Ibuka's company paid $25,000 for a license to develop the transistor. At that stage, the Americans didn't think it would be suitable for radios.
The Americans asked what we were going to use them for. I said we wanted to make radios. They said it's not worth bothering. In America, the only kind of transistors in production were for lower audio frequencies. They told us there's no way you'll make a high-frequency transistor. Give up the idea.
2 years later, before any major American manufacturers, Dr. Ibuka had adapted the device and managed to make transistor radios.
This is the first pocket transistor radio. In order to make it, the components we'd used up to then were totally useless. The speaker, the condenser, the antenna bar, the resistor, all had to be improved. So all Japanese electronic technology developed from the transistor radio. The transistor radio was the foundation.
Sony's lead was followed by other Japanese companies. From the start, they saw the export potential, and the first transistor radios were shipped to the United States in 1958. Television exports followed radios, but overall, Japanese electronics were still way behind the United States, so MITI pushed electronics hard. Foreign manufacturers weren't allowed to set up in Japan unless they'd share their technology, and like other new industries, electronics was protected by tariffs.
This barrier was necessary to develop strong industry and allow us to negotiate with foreign industries on a more equal footing. But until we were strong enough, we kept the doors tight shut. If we opened them too early, the wind might blow everything flat.
All the government guidance, the technology and the investment would have achieved little without the changes that also came in labor relations. Immediately after the war, new unions with left-wing leaderships challenged companies in a battle for control. Inflation and the shortage of food increased the aggravation. There was a series of big strikes and lockouts in heavy industry and textiles.
One big strike that was typical of the post-war period was the Omi-Keishi dispute. I was leader of the strike, which lasted 160 days. It was a strike aimed at preserving the basic right of the union. We were fighting for our own survival. While it lasted, 3 workers committed suicide. I came out on demonstrations and was often threatened by the management heavies, but we fought on.
To confront the new unions, Japanese managers banded together. They founded an employers' federation, the Nikkeiren. Mr. Shikanai was its first organizer.
The managers who had to face up to this belligerent labor movement were pretty inexperienced. They had no experience of dealing with pressure from the radical Communist Party. No agreement could ever be reached through conventional negotiation, and that was very difficult. The strikes were like measles. If treated properly, then industry would recover and be healthier. But if you treated them in a rather slapdash way, then industry would just limp along. So I encouraged the manager's side. I told them, you can let the fire burn unchecked for the first 5 minutes. But in the last 5 minutes, fight it with all your might, for the sake of the future. Whatever the hardships, you've got to fight in that last 5 minutes.
The final battle with the left-wing unions came as late as 1960 in coal mining, already a declining industry.
17日には三河港の貯炭層前の広場におよそ10万人を動員。三池を守る大集会を開き、あくまで貯炭層を守り抜くと規制を上げました。
The miners' union took on Mitsui, the powerful conglomerate, which was a symbol of Japanese capitalism before and after the war. The struggle lasted a year, but they failed. The miners were forced to accept the company's cutbacks. In the new order, most big companies had cooperative workforces. The first unions gave way to less political enterprise unions. Workers were won over with better conditions and security. A job for life.
Everybody understood very well that when they joined a company, it meant that their jobs were for life. Therefore, rather than complain about the petty grievances they came across from day to day, everybody was willing to carry on working, totally absorbed in what they were doing.
Big companies were paternalistic. They gave their workers housing, welfare, and annual bonuses. In return, they expected loyalty.
I came to think that without an improvement in the economy, working conditions and wages wouldn't improve either. But when I went abroad, especially to England, I was often criticized as a trade unionist for accepting the low level of Japanese pay. Unlike the English, I came to the conclusion that without improvement in the national economy, wages just wouldn't rise.
One of the first Westerners to see what was happening wrote a book called Japanese Factory in 1958.
I had reported that Japanese companies, large companies, did not fire people, paid people basically in terms of seniority rather than merit, that the unions were enterprise unions, so-called, taking in only the employees of the company. And in the West, in the United States, the book was published through MIT, the conclusion was you simply couldn't run companies that way. After all, if you couldn't fire people, you couldn't deal with cyclic changes in demand. If you promoted people on seniority, how could you possibly reward merit, and the like.
And few in the West appreciated the huge investment that was taking place either. Japan was pouring well over 30% of its annual income into new plant and equipment, compared to 18% in Britain or 16% in the USA. Only 20 years after the war, Japan was exporting steel that was cheaper and of higher quality than American or European steel. The shipyards were now launching the biggest ships in the world, up to 200,000 tons. Their technology and building systems had left Europe way behind. Japan had a new motor industry to supply the rising home demand, though its world potential was yet to be seen. And exports of electronics were growing fast on the appeal of quality as much as price. The dreams of the planners who'd met in the rubble of 1945 had now been exceeded. The new prosperity rested on foreign trade. The government export organization, JETRO, sponsored this film.
皆様、これから始まりますメイドイン日本のこのショーをしばらくの間皆様とご一緒に楽しみたいと思います。ところでメイドイン日本、日本製品を皆様はどのようにお考えでいらっしゃいますか？素敵なメイドイン日本。日本製品、それは 我らの命我らの力よたとえメイドイン日本日本製品それがつまらないものでも我らの製品
The explanation for Japan's rapid recovery in the first 20 years after the war depended on who you talked to. Some felt American help and know-how had been all-important.
These days, the contribution that was made by the American people to the Japanese economy and to the rebuilding and the rehabilitation of their production base, I think the Japanese do not appreciate it, or there are very few expressions, if any, of appreciation. During the time of the occupation and during the period immediately following, say in the 1950-51 period, there were explicit expressions of appreciation. But that history, I think, is being glossed over, and there are, I think, attempts to rewrite history on the part of the Japanese government.
The bureaucrats in the Japanese government and in the Ministry of Trade and Industry believed it was their leadership and guidance that had been crucial.
We were working on behalf of the whole people, the whole nation, not just ourselves or a particular company. We had a very strong sense that we were doing something that served the national interest. And that was the joy we derived from our work.
But the most popular explanation among the Japanese themselves was the high level of education and the quality of the workforce, and their Japaneseness.
When I went to Australia, England and Canada, I found that they were always taking tea breaks in the morning and afternoon. They were hardly ever at their workplaces. I thought the Japanese were far more hard-working.
I think foreign workers only do the work that is given to them, whereas the Japanese will do more than is asked and go off and think and research by themselves. I think this is the big difference.
People helped each other. That's the way things were throughout the country at that time. A family spirit developed. Everybody realized that if we wanted to recover and be happy, we'd have to pull together. I think the grouping together, the sense of community, this sort of monoracial thing, the fact that we are an homogeneous race, played a major part in Japan's recovery. Perhaps to the extent that you could say this was the reason Japan was later criticized for being self-centered and exclusive.
In 1967, gross production passed Britain. In 1968, France. In 1969, West Germany. Japan had become the third biggest economy in the world. They'd caught up, but they'd changed both Japanese society and the Japanese islands forever.
The Tokyo Olympic Games of 1964 symbolized Japan's recovery, and with the economic miracle came changes in the way the Japanese lived, as we see in Nippon at 8:35 next Sunday.